Okay, so attachment, trauma, and the amygdala of the brain. This is all really important neurobiology and neurochemistry that we're going to be learning about much later in this particular module. We're going to do a course on neurobiology around attachment and trauma and neurobiology. But what is important to know for this particular class is that there are brain circuits that process trustworthiness in the face, and they're activated very early on in life. And so what you can see in this interaction between a grandpa and a baby is that the baby is learning social cues by reading the micro emotions on the grandpa's face in this interaction. You can see the baby is very relaxed, has a little smile on his face, and he's kind of looking at grandpa saying, I'm really trying to figure you out because you're making a fun face at me. I feel safe and I can learn social cues by interacting with you. So you can see how this whole environment for this particular baby in this event really provides an opportunity for this baby to learn about reading trustworthiness and facial features that are on a micro level. You know, this is never conscious for any of us. We all read micro emotions instantaneously, and they report to our amygdala and say, hey, this is a safe situation. Hey, this is a dangerous situation. But we're training or wiring or recording this information into our amygdala early on in life, just like this engagement interaction with this grandpa and baby. But it happens with everybody that the baby engages with. So it's so important to recognize, oh, wow, this is super cool. These engagements are important because they're fun, but also because they're really wiring the brain for the baby for information that the baby's going to need throughout life in order to recognize trustworthiness in other faces, because we want that information to be, we want them to be able to carry that information over from one face to another face to another face. So, all right, let's check out the next slide. Now, attachment, trauma, and the amygdala in the brain. Also, the amygdala also is one of the fear centers, and it has a role in the expression of fear and in the processing of fearful stimuli. So if something scary happens, this is what happens in the brain. This is what's so cool about modern neuroscience is that we can actually look inside the brain and see what gets activated under certain circumstances. So you can see the yellowy orange parts, and you can see the little almond spot that's kind of pulsating in the middle. That's the amygdala. So in the presence of fearful stimuli, boo, something scary happens, the frontal cortex lights up, the amygdala is pulsing and saying, whoa, what do I do with this? This is scary. I'm not really sure how to handle it. And the brain stem, the lower part, is activated because think about what happens when you get scared. Your breathing starts to increase faster, your heart rate beats faster, you're not hungry, you're getting ready to go into how do I deal with this situation? Flight, fight, freeze, or fawn response. And those are associated with negative emotions. So our amygdala is kind of the reporter and says, this is what you need to do in this situation. If something scary or fear producing happens, you need to make an instant, implicit, unconscious decision about what to do. Your brain and your body decide this for you without your conscious awareness. It just happens. And that's the miracle and awesomeness of our bodies and our minds. So, like I said, we're going to learn a lot more about the neurobiology and neuroscience of brain development and child development in the 4th class of Ticker 1, Module 1. So stay tuned. But I wanted you to see this so you can kind of see that the amygdala has this dual role of teaching us how to read trustworthiness, but it also alerts us to fearful situations and says, oh, whoa, you need to pay attention. This is not a good situation. So if that baby in the hands of the grandpa just like clenched up and cried, guess what? That's the amygdala again, acting up and saying, ooh, something about this person is scary, and the baby is reacting to it. And it could be from the baby's previous experience, or it could be related to the person. That's why it's so important that we learn how to be in tune and in touch with the people who are around infants and young children, as well as how those infants and young children respond to others. All right, and their temperament. Okay, so let's move into adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. I've used the term throughout this class, and it's in reference to a landmark study, and it's called the ACEs study, and it was conducted by Vince Felitti and Robert Anda. It was a collaboration between the CDC, Center of Disease Control, and Kaiser Permanente. It's the largest study of its kind where we look at adverse childhood experiences and compare them to health and wellness, so mental health and physical health consequences based off of those adverse childhood experiences. It's a very simple screening to come up with an ACE score. But what I want to share with you about the origination of this study was Vince Felitti ran a weight management program in San Diego, California. And what he learned, where people were losing significant amounts of weight, like 300, 400 pounds. And what he found was the participants in the program, as they became more and more successful, their likelihood of just disappearing from the program increased. So success created this situation where people left the program. And so he was wondering why that happened, and began to explore asking people about their childhood experiences that led to this excessive protective weight gain, to see if there were events in their early childhood or their childhood that may explain a need for that weight to be protective for them. So there's an entire class again on protective weight gain. I will never call it obesity because I think that that's one unkind. It's a medical term that needs to be retired, because we know that protective weight gain comes from the consequence of early trauma, and it's both psychological and physical health. It's a physical health consequence. So, all right. So then once Vince Felitti started to have this experience of, wow, I think something else is going on, he contacted the CDC, and then they did, after the preliminary studies, they advanced that and made a much larger study to see if there really were medical correlations to these emotional traumatic experiences in childhood. So there are 3 categories of adverse childhood experiences. There's the abuse category, that happens to my body. There's the neglect category, that also happens to my body. And then there's household challenges, and that happens in my environment where I live, the people that I live with. So there's 3 categories of adverse childhood experiences, but there are 10 actual listed adverse childhood experiences. I'll share with you that I believe there are lots and lots more, many more adverse childhood experiences that aren't on the list. But you'll see why that doesn't really matter, because the message is, and the result of this information is that we know that early trauma, adversity in childhood, does lead to mental and physical health consequences across the lifespan. And that result is very conclusive. So with that, let's go to the next slide. I'm going to show you what the actual ACEs are. So these are the adverse childhood experiences. So if you were to check the box of each one of these, it's basically is like doing an ACEs screening. Abuse, physical, emotional, or sexual abuse. Physical abuse is being hit to the extent of leaving a mark. That would be considered physical abuse. Emotional abuse is being thrown, rocks being thrown at you, but they're emotional sayings. You're ugly, you're mean, you're worthless, you're not going to become anything in life. You're just worthless. That's pretty much a very common harmful thing to say to people, and that is in the category of emotional abuse. And we say sticks and stones can break our bones, but names can never hurt us, and that it could not be less true in the universe. We absolutely know that physical harm actually is well, we know that emotional abuse is more harmful and has different and long-term consequences than physical abuse, because with physical abuse, other people can see that abuse. And when somebody sees that you're hurting, they're more likely to respond to that hurting. But emotional abuse happens inside us. And so a lot of times, unless we tell somebody and articulate it well, people don't respond the same way as they do to physical abuse. So, and then there's sexual abuse, and we all know what sexual abuse is. That's penetration, fondling, molesting of a person under the age of 18 by another person. So it can be a parent, a caregiver, a friend, a family friend, a relative, anybody, but it's unwanted sexual contact before the age of 18 is sexual abuse. All right, next category also happens to our body. Physical neglect, emotional neglect. Physical neglect is I don't have the things that I need, like food, clean water, space to live in, space, that is safe from heat or cold. So, or loving caregiving is really also a part of neglect, but emotional neglect is the absolute absence of somebody being emotionally connected to a person. So basically, it's as if you're completely unseen. So when different from emotional abuse, you're worthless, you're ugly, you're never going to amount to anything. Emotional neglect is like, I don't even care about your existence. You don't even matter enough for me to look at you, feed you, do anything for you, because you are worthless, but I'm not even acknowledging your presence. That's how worthless you are. So you can see emotional neglect has a powerful messaging that people get when they're unseen by other people in their environment, especially their loving caregivers. It's very traumatic. All right, next category, household challenges. We also know that there are lots of things that happen in people's homes or their environments that impact their long-term health and their long-term mental health. The incarceration of a family member, parent, caregiver, sibling, uncle, aunt, somebody in the home. The misuse of substances. So if somebody misuses alcohol, any kind of substance in the household that would alter somebody's way of engaging. The loss of a caregiver or parent. So by separation, divorce, or death of a caregiver, hugely powerful experience to lose a caregiver in childhood. It's like having the world pulled out from under you. So witnessing domestic violence, so that's watching somebody that you love, a loving caregiver, be beat up, basically, or experiencing violence, especially from somebody else you love or somebody else that you care about, or living with somebody who has a mental illness. And there's a myriad of those kinds of experiences, but that again alters the consistency and predictability of how somebody will act if they have a mental illness that, shifts and changes. And that can be really confusing for kids. So, all right. So these are our 3 categories, 10 adverse childhood experiences. You could see how living in a violent neighborhood could be added to this list as a household challenge in terms of an adverse childhood experience. However, it's not on here. So, but you'll see why it doesn't really matter at this point in terms of what we're learning from this particular study and why it's called the landmark study. So what we do is we look at that list of adverse childhood experiences and then we compare them to experiences in adulthood. So to see if there's a correlation, to see if there's a relationship between the number of adverse childhood experiences and the number of medical consequences related to those adverse childhood experiences. So what they found was the higher the ACE score, the more adult pharmacy utilization. So that means the more times people go to the pharmacy, the more doctor visits, there are more emergency room visits, there are more hospitalizations. People with higher ACE scores die earlier and younger than people with lower adverse childhood experience scores. So there's a correlation. Don't get confused with causation. It doesn't mean that adverse childhood experiences cause these things. There's a relationship we need to understand and explore because they relate to each other. So I'll give you an example of causation. People who eat a lot of ice cream drown more frequently. Now, we could easily say, wow, people drown because they eat ice cream. But that's because there's a correlation between eating ice cream and drowning. But when you dig deeper into that information, what we understand is that people eat ice cream often when the weather is hot, often around pools or ponds or rivers or places where there's water because it's, usually summer or lovely out. And so the correlation is that people who eat ice cream drown more often because guess what? They're actually around places that they can drown. It really has nothing to do with the ice cream. It has everything to do with the location. So there's a relationship between ice cream and drowning, but it's not a cause and effect relationship. So I wanted to explain that. We can't just say this happens and this happens, or this happens because this happened. It's not that direct, but it still is, okay, we need to be aware of these things, the correlation, the relationship. So there is a relationship between trauma and future health risks, mental health as well as physical health. The root of much of adult medicine correlates with major health and social problems. So rarely do any of these ACEs on the list happen in isolation. You don't often have somebody who experiences emotional neglect without experiencing physical neglect, or maybe misuse of substances in the house. So there's a likelihood that if you experience one ACE, that there's another ACE right on following up, and then even then another ACE following right up on that one. So they rarely happen in isolation, and they are related to social problems. So think about addiction, misuse of alcohol, misuse of substances can lead to addiction, and that addiction is a social problem that leads to medical consequences, potentially leading to earlier death. So this is how we roll these concepts out in a scientific way when we think about trauma and health risks and how to mediate that and pull it back and say, oh, if we help support people with their substance misuse issues, then we're going to contribute to their extension of life expectancy. And that is exactly what happens. Okay, so I don't want to beat a dead horse, but ACEs and health risks, the prevalence of adverse childhood experiences and the correlation to specific health issues make trauma the prime determinant of health, social well-being, and the economic well-being of our country or our nation. What does that mean? That's a lot of big words and concepts. So it means that we can correlate, we can see the relationship between adverse childhood experiences and how they contribute to the health of the nation, the social well-being of the nation, as well as the economic well-being. The health, because we know that trauma increases the likelihood that somebody will experience mental or physical health issues. The social well-being, because if you are experiencing mental or physical health issues, then your ability to contribute to the social environment, family, school, community, becomes impaired and makes that harder to carry on. And the economic well-being is that physical health and mental health are very costly products. You know, taking care of our bodies and our minds, we spend a lot of money on healthcare every single year. If we were to shift the focus to reducing trauma and adverse childhood experiences, we could actually save billions of dollars in the long run in terms of treating the health risks of asthma, heart disease, stroke, diabetes, early death, and a myriad substance misuse, mental health issues. I mean, it just goes on and on. So it is a very profound study to understand and then to look at ways to implement into our future healthcare planning. All right.